Alright, here we are for another video. This is Brian Kibler with StarCityGames.com. We're playing a little more modern, and as you can see on your screen, we are playing on the new beta client because we can't play on the normal client. It actually took me a while to figure out how to even get this to fit the appropriate resolution I need to record at. But here we are. We are going to be playing some Naya, and basically I was playing a little bit, as you know, could be seen in my previous videos, with the green-white Aether Vial deck. Wasn't really impressed by the power level of the individual cards in the deck, and it's possible that that particular build wasn't great. I may still mess around a little bit with that, but I don't have much time because it's actually Thursday night when I'm recording this, and I'm leaving for the Grand Prix tomorrow. This is a deck that, you know, I have enjoyed for a very long time. This general style of deck, I had some success with, you know, a Domri Naya deck even before Wild Mikado was unbanned. But really, the sort of core of this deck is just a lot of the cards are individually very powerful, and they certainly also just work well together. Cards like Tarmogoyf and Wild Mikado just have high individual power level, much, you know, to the contrary of cards like Leon and Arbiter, which are very reliant on particular sorts of synergies in order to actually be effective. So this deck, you know, has you know, the ability to just win through sheer card power. A card like, you know, Knight of the Reliquary can come down and basically just dominate the game by itself because of the sheer power of that card, and, you know, along with the synergies that it has with the rest of the cards in the deck. The specifics of this particular build compared to previous builds: I'm playing 3 copies of Qasali Pridemage and only 1 Lightning Helix. There seemed to be a decline in zoo-style decks, in aggressive decks. In the format, the only real aggressive deck that really sees much play right now is Affinity, or Robots, whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it Robots, you are wrong. But and Qasali Pridemage is actually better than Lightning Helix against those decks because it can deal with the key cards that they rely on, like cranial plating. Lightning Helix isn't particularly good against Pod. It's fine. It's an okay removal spell, but it's not very efficient. You don't really care about the life gain. And it's not very good against Splinter Twin. So those are the 3 sort of top decks in the format, and it's not really very good against any of them. It's still a reasonable card that has applications in a lot of different matchups, but it's not a card that I think that I want a bunch of in my main deck. Whereas Pridemage is excellent in all 3 of those matchups, and is just a generally good proactive card. So that's sort of why I made this switch. It's possible that the Lightning Helix is, you know, should go entirely. It's possible this deck wants, you know, another creature or something in the main deck to replace that Helix, just based on the way that the metagame shapes up. Maybe you just want 4 Pridemages. Who knows? But anyway, I only have 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze. I know a lot of people like 4 copies of Scavenging Ooze. Ooze is a card that takes a lot to get going. You know, in the mid-game scenario, Ooze is very powerful, or in a scenario where you are playing against a deck that utilizes its graveyard heavily, Ooze is very powerful. It's possible that, you know, that could maybe become the 4th Ooze, but Ooze is also a card that in multiples gets substantially weaker, particularly given the decline in aggressive matchups where a lot of creatures are dying all the time. So the real finishers in this deck are just Knight of the Reliquary. Domri is a card that can, you know, give you incremental advantages as the game progresses. It's not great against Twin. I do think it's actually pretty solid against both Affinity and against Pod. It's actually one of your best cards against Pod, just as a way to generate advantages that can also be a removal spell. And Thundermail Hellkite isn't particularly great against Twin or Affinity, but is quite good against Pod as just a flyer who can break through against them. This configuration of the deck isn't particularly good against combo decks like Storm, but it does have a lot of tools against a lot of other decks in the sideboard, most notably Blood Moon. Blood Moon is one of the keys to this deck's effectiveness. The ability to shut down your opponent's non-basic lands can just take a lot of different opponents, regardless of what deck they're playing, out of the match. And it's also a non-creature threat against control decks that may not necessarily have entirely non-basic lands like some decks do, but are heavily reliant on things like Celestial Colonnade, or, you know, have very color mana intensive spells like Cryptic Command. And even if they do have basics, you can take that with Choke. Choke is a card that I think is super powerful and doesn't see nearly as much play as it should in Modern. It can take out some decks by itself. You're able to resolve a choke against like a Storm deck even. It's a deck that is typically very difficult for a deck like this to compete with. But you can just resolve a choke and they are almost certainly dead. So the other sideboard changes here from some of the previous versions. I have 3 copies of Stony Silence. I actually had 0 at the Pro Tour. Basically, Stony Silence is just a more powerful card than Ancient Grudge in terms of combating decks like Affinity. Ancient Grudge is powerful but doesn't completely shut them down, whereas Stony Silence shuts down pretty much everything they have in play as well as most of everything they can do. Particularly alongside Kasali Pridemage, Stony Silence is very potent because you can pick apart their individual attackers and shut down most of their deck. You can sometimes run into Etched Champion giving you trouble, but that isn't quite as big a deal when you do have stuff like Linvala that can actually fly over their guys. Linvala is actually a card that is shockingly good against Affinity because their deck is heavily reliant on the pump effects from both Ravager and Overseer in order to actually be effective, and has a bunch of small flyers. So Linvala is actually pretty sweet there. It's also clearly excellent against pod decks and against Splinter Twin. So if you do happen to play a mirror match or against a deck with similar sort of creature setup, like Scavenging Ooze heavy deck or whatever, Linvala can also be quite good there. It's not as good against Jund as it used to be because a lot of the Jund decks now don't have as many activated abilities on creatures now that Deathrite Shaman is gone. Some of this is just a mix of various things I wanted to try. I have 1 copy of Chandra in my sideboard for mid-range and control type matchups, a copy of Thrun against a control type decks or just counterspell decks, and then a single copy of Bonfire. I actually had 3 copies of Bonfire in my sideboard for a little while prior to Pro Tour Valencia. I'm just like, where was the last modern Pro Tour? And it's quite good against token strategies as well as against pod, and it's also quite good against Affinity decks. It's not the best card you can have against some of them. One deck that I'm kind of cheating on cards against right with this particular version is Boggles. I don't know how popular that deck will be, but having a bunch of Pride Mages is quite good against them because their deck is frequently reliant on actually assembling a big guy with Vigilance thanks to Daybreak Coronet. And that's another reason I may want to consider actually just having 4 copies of Pride Mage and not bothering with this Lightning Helix. So anyway, that is where this stands right now. That's what we're going to play. We're going to jump into some 8-player queues, assuming we can actually get the beta to work, and we'll go from there. So anyway, let's get to it.